So, guys, I want to review the South Park episode Sermon on the Mount, and I also want to say that I will continue a pattern of reviewing South Park episodes weekly, and I'll also continue a pattern of reviewing, other adult animations like King of the Hill, and also the Boondocks and other series that I feel fit because I am somebody who likes satire. And I do want to say that Sermon on the Mount is definitely a really funny episode of South Park. But usually when I watch the current season of South Park, sometimes I don't laugh. I might chuckle just a little bit. I just like it as a satire, and it does feel like very satire force, and it also feels very on the nose. And what I mean by that is that when you look at all the jokes on it, it may not make you laugh really. It may not surprise you because ultimately it's a lot of stuff ripped from the headlines, just like the issue with Donald Trump suing people and other issues like that. You kind of almost know where South Park is going to go based on what's happening in the media the past, week or the past couple of weeks. It's almost like a little unfunny because they lose the ability to be unpredictable. So I want to go through this episode. So the episode opens with Cartman in bed, and then he gets out of bed, and you see him brushing his teeth. And also, what South Park likes to do is they like to throw in Easter eggs to other episodes. So when you see Cartman going into the bathroom, he talks to his Alexis, and that's a reference to that episode White People Renovating Houses, where he's obsessed with Siri and Alexis. You see photos. You see a picture of Cartman dressed up in the AIDS clothes in that episode where Cartman has AIDS, where he has like a big scarf and he has like a red shirt. And then the other things you see Cartman, and a photo of Cartman as a little child. That's a reference to when Cartman was a kindergartner. That episode where he sets his teacher on fire and pees on her, and they blame Trent Boyette. And then there's another pit photo of trees, and that's a reference to Cartman Sucks because in that episode it's revealed that Cartman is a photographer. And then there's another picture of Cartman and Leanne by the Grand Canyon, and that's kind of like a reference to the first episode, because if you remember the first episode, there's a picture of Cartman and Leanne right by Mount Rushmore. So it is kind of almost like maybe like an update, really, like saying, okay, instead of just Mount Rushmore, we're going to update it to the Grand Canyon. And it also shows how broke they are, really, because Colorado and the Grand Canyon are not that far away. It's in driving distance. It's maybe like an overnight trip, really, versus going to South Dakota, which would be a couple of days, or you have to fly to South Dakota, where Mount Rushmore is. The other thing too is that right by the Alexis plant, you see this plant in a purple jar, and you see long stems, really, and that's a reference to the member berries, because the member berries were purple, and then they had long leaves to them, so and very striking green leaves. So they're referencing a bunch of different episodes, and they like to do that to reward people who pay attention. Like, you watch any of Dash React stuff, he'll show you all the references South Park does to other episodes. So what happens is that Cartman wants to listen to NPR, and it gets canceled, and he's kind of a little put off by this. And we're also a little put off by this as well, because you're kind of why is Cartman upset that a very liberal station is canceled? And it's later revealed in the episode that he's just he laughs at people who are on that because they're just bitching about trying to make the world more fair, more liberal. So it's almost like Cartman finds humor in finding a more liberal world. He finds humor in finding a liberal world tolerable. He just finds it all ridiculous and silly and outrageous and other things like that. So Cartman goes to the bus stop, and what happens is that he mentions things about NPR being canceled, and then he's like, who's going to make fun of the Jews and other things like that. So, and then Kyle kind of gives a look really, or here we go again, really, because we all know a majority of the South Park episodes, Cartman is anti-Semitic and rubs it and puts it in Kyle's face, really. And then also, I don't believe Kyle has one speaking line in this episode, if I'm correct. And then also Cartman says a meta line, and a meta line is, what show will the government cancel next? And then he also, because because later on they talk about Colbert being canceled, and then South Park is on Paramount. So later on, they talk about South Park possibly getting canceled. Um, and then also, like, what Cartman's also saying is that, like, what really hurts is that because Trump is president and woke culture is dead, like, when everybody's making fun of Jews, or when everybody's saying homophobic slurs, and when everybody is, just being anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ, Cartman does not stand out in this world, because it's almost like everybody is as hateful as before, really. When you're in a world where everybody is accepting, that one or two bigots stand out, but in a world where you take away the wokeness and everybody's kind of hateful and everything like that, then you don't stand out, really, So Cartman just wishes that the world was more like liberal and more woke, so that way he kind of stands out, really. And they talk about this a little bit later, and in some reviews, people say it's just Trey and Mac being like, okay, they always want to be counterculture. So when liberalism and woke culture was big, they had characters like PC Principal be satires of the woke culture. So it's almost like a metaphor how Matt and Trey have to change their trajectory. They want to be counterculture. So now they're going to be like maybe more pro woke, because the culture now is more pro Trump and getting rid of the woke culture, like anti woke. And then, what happens is that, like, PC Principal calls an assembly, and he says that he wants to turn things around, and he's not going to let the corruptness of the world come into the school and corrupt the school. He's sick and tired of how people are treated for being compassionate, and the one thing that'll bring normality is the Bible. And he says something like, we spit in God's face, and he's the only one who can change things back. And this is a reference to a bunch of things, that there are some people who have a lot of mixed beliefs with woke and anti-woke. So when he says something like, I'm not going to let the corruption of the world corrupt the school, I'm sick and tired of people being, hurt for being compassionate and other things like that. So it's a reference to two things, that, there are people who don't like the woke culture. Like, for example, there are people who talk about, like, how there's trans people using the women's bathrooms, and there's been some instances, not all trans people, but in a few instances, that some trans people are actually people saying that they're trans so they can go into the bathrooms and sexually assault women. Like, there's a story, and I don't have it with me, of somebody talking about, like, how their daughter or a friend of one of their daughters was sexually assaulted by a trans student, or a person pretending to be trans because, of that rule that trans people can go to whatever bathroom they want to. So that's an example of a anti-woke argument. And a woke argument would be, you look at what's going on in California with a lot of people protesting ICE and other things like that, where people are being assaulted by police officers, even if people are rioting as well, really. Or you look at, how, because of Trump, there's a lot more anti-LGBTQ, so there are people, like, facing hate crimes. There's also hate crimes against, like, Hispanics and other things like that. So, like, whether you are pro-woke or anti-woke, everybody's taking a bit of damage, really, So, and as PC Principal kind of said, really, the way to fix that is, is to bring God back, really, because a lot of people, like, would pray or believe that God fixes everything, like during the slavery days, a lot of the slaves just prayed to God, hoping that, someday their suffrage will be over. Or a lot of black people did during the Jim Crow era, is that there was a group of black people who did nothing about civil rights. They just prayed every single day to God that the world would be better for them. But there are some people who are activists, really. And usually when you are in situations, and they talk about this, where it feels hopeless or it feels like activism is being punished, you still got to fight harder and harder. And South Park is a show that's going to fight harder and harder. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. So the show Jesus in School, talking to the assembly, And then Stan goes home, and Stan mentions to his father that Jesus shows up. Randy goes, "What is Jesus doing in school? I don't think Jesus is allowed in school." So, what Randy does is he talks to Siri about this. And Siri mentions that, there's separation of church and state, which means that if you're in school and you're talking about religion in the sense of teaching the history of religion, that's okay. But it's also good to teach other religions as well and the history and the rules of those religions, so it doesn't feel like you're endorsing one. But if there is a school that does something like says, hey, you know what, we're going to convert you to Islam or Judaism, Christianity, or other religions, that's not right. And then there's also a few other things in this scene as well, really, that Randy's talking about the issue with Siri instead of his wife, really. So it kind of shows, like how technology is hurting relationships because people are bonding more with technology. And then the other thing, too, is that he's researching because, usually when you learn, about the amendments and other things, that's something you learn in middle school. And it's almost like, why is Randy needing to research this? This should be something that a lot of people would already know, really. So it kind of shows a little bit of how, because people rely a lot on technology, they just are not going out to be educated, or they're like, hey, you know what, I don't know a lot about this stuff, like the amendments and separation of church and state, maybe I should read more about this. And then the other thing, too, with Randy talking about this to Siri, it reminds me of the episode of The Shake Weight where Sharon relies heavily on talking to the Shake Weight artificial intelligence instead of Randy about her issues. And then the other thing, too, is that Randy farts in bed, really. And I believe, after, at the end of the Shake Weight episode, after he gets a hand job by his wife, Randy farts as well, really. So it's another reference to the Shake Weight to a different episode. Then they cut to Cartman, and Cartman says, woke is dead. What am I supposed to do? Everybody does anti-Semitism and gay slurs. And I'm looking at my notes here. And what happens is that it cuts to the bar, and there are a bunch of adults talking. So they're like, the government will see if you disagree about Jesus in school. We voted to get rid of all the woke stuff. This retarded faggot just arrests people and sue people and puts money in his own pocket. So the adults are talking about these things, and then also I'll talk a little bit about my ideas around this. That first of all, what I'll say is that America, there is free speech in the amendments, but you have limitations on free speech. Like, you can't say hi to your friend Jack in an airport. They call it clear and present danger. And then there's also, media contracts. So it's almost like if the government doesn't like what you're saying, you can be censored, because if you're working on an outlet such as Paramount, or you have movie contracts or other things, the bosses of your company will be like, hey, you can't say this because we don't want to get sued or deal with issues. Or it's almost like that episode where they wanted to show Muhammad, where they made the joke that in the episode of South Park, they showed it, but in the regular world, Matt and Trey couldn't show it because of Comedy Central, really. So and that's the issue with Paramount. They have limitations to what Matt and Trey can say, really, and do, because of Matt and Trey fighting for free speech, but also on the other side, they have to deal with Paramount and the contracts that they're getting and the rules around that, the parameters around that. And then also the guy saying retarded faggot is just a reference to what the earlier scene where Cartman says you can say gay and homophobic slurs, really. How we're getting back to that. We're going back in time to the 90s when saying stuff like that was okay. And then they go to Garrison's house with, a mob, and they found out that Garrison is not the surrogate Trump anymore. And that's also kind of a reference to a couple of seasons where Donald Trump, the surrogate Trump, or the voice of Trump, was done by Mr. Garrison. And I also think this is also a little bit of fan service, because a lot of people didn't like how they had a lot of just Mr. Garrison become Donald Trump, really. Like, Mr. Garrison's Mr. Garrison. Donald Trump is Donald Trump, really. So it's not good that you kind of almost take one character and you make him wear a costume of Trump, really. Like, they try to, like, make Trump his own character in South Park. Don't, like, try to take somebody and turn him into that. So I think that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to, like, say, okay, Garrison is going to be Garrison, Trump is going to be Trump, really. So it's just like a reset. The next part of it is that they cut to Donald Trump in the White House, and you hear Middle Eastern music. So automatically, if you are somebody who's watched South Park from the beginning, seen Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, the South Park movie, you know it's references to Saddam Hussein. You see Donald Trump in a chair, he turns around, and then you see him with a bunch of like magazine cutouts of his face, really, and his face is moving in the same way as Saddam Hussein, the character in South Park. So so they're kind of like making a joke that, like, the way that Donald Trump is censoring media, is threatening people with lawsuits, is bringing back Christianity in school in a country where it's freedom of religion, and encouraging, states and other and education systems to bring back Christianity in schools. Maybe in the Bible Belt, these things are going to be voted on. It's the same thing as, Iraq and other countries with strict laws and stuff like that. Like, in other countries, they will force people to do Islam. In other countries, if media speaks out about issues, that will be censored, really. Just like in, like in North Korea or whatever, in those countries as well, really, where if you want to speak out about the government, you get killed for that. Or if you import music from, like, South Korea, you get killed for that in other countries. Or you speak out or have, like, radios and people talk about other things, like in the Soviet Union, that happened as well, really, where people would import music or talk about how other countries are better. You'd be executed or be sent to, like, Siberia for that. So it's almost like the lawsuits is the way to, have a bit of fear. Is to say, okay, I'm afraid of being sued, so therefore we're going to allow Trump to do what he wants, really. So, like, the whole, like, kind of like meta that he's like Saddam Hussein character works. Later on in the episode, you see him, like, pass a couple of drawings where there's a couple of painting where you see him do sexual acts with animals. You see him have a small penis, and you also see, like, a picture of him with a big fat belly and, like, a and golden leaves around his head, like he's supposed to be, like, Julius Caesar or Bacchus or one of the Roman emperors as well, really, because a lot of the Roman emperors were like that as well, really, where if you crossed them, there were consequences. And also, they have, like, tiny dicks and stuff, and I'm not sure if that's a reference to anything. Like, I'm not sure there's stories about of Donald Trump being impotent in the bedroom or stuff like that. Like, honestly, he's in his 70s, so obviously men at that age don't have a lot of testosterone. But it's also just like what another YouTuber was saying, where it's kind of almost like a crude joke about Donald Trump, really. It's almost like saying, okay, well, Donald Trump is too dumb to understand satire, so we're going to show that we're making fun of him by just doing dick jokes, because maybe that's something he can get, because that's very simple for him. And the other thing I want to, and then the other thing too, is that you see him in bed with Satan, and it's two jokes, because obviously it's saying that Donald Trump is a horrible person enough for Satan to have a relationship with him, and also too, it's a reference to Saddam Hussein, because in the earlier seasons, Saddam Hussein had a homosexual relationship with Satan, so they're trying to, like, they're trying to say, okay, there's a lot of just similarities between how Saddam Hussein, the dictator, did things, and how Donald Trump, people see him as the dictator of the U.S., really. And then it cuts to Cartman walking down the street, really, and Cartman, and Cartman, like, you hear him thinking to himself. He says, like, I cannot, and he's thinking to himself how he can't instigate others, really. So it's almost like woke is dead, because he wants to instigate. He wants to stand out for being, like, kind of like getting under people's skin, really. So it's kind of like what I call a flip, or it's kind of more like a flip a subversion of expectations, or like or a converse. An inversion's a bad word. An inversion, because there are people who are depressed that woke is not there, and they feel like they don't have a voice in America anymore. And the other thing too is that he wants to do and then also too, he passes by two bathrooms, and then you see it says men's only, women's only, because there are many people who are doing that nowadays, where they're saying we don't want trans people to use the women's room or the men's room, because we want to make sure that everybody is safe, really. And like I've said, that there are trans people who, just like anybody else, who will use every bathroom and be okay. And then there's people who will use the bathrooms that are assigned to them and be okay. There'll be people that will use bathrooms for anybody, do horrible things to other people, and there will be people like who follow the rules and do horrible things to other people in the bathroom. So, just to say it fairly, really. And what Cartman's saying too, is because wokeness is dead, he wants to form a suicide pact with Butters. And then this is also something that's been going on too, is that there are people who are very depressed. There are some people who get very dramatic, and they say like, oh, I want to kill myself and whatever. And sometimes they're saying it to be drama queens. And sometimes people are, and I'm very sure it's probably happened, there's some people who are trans, there's some people who are pro-woke and don't feel like that they fit in this country, whether they be LGBTQ or non-LGBTQ, whether they be like from whatever group, really. There are people who are committing suicide or encouraging other people to commit suicide in response to it being a pro-Trump world, really. So, or thinking about that, or dealing with depression and other issues. But obviously, when Cartman is having Butters kill himself along with him, it's kind of like, it's kind of almost a reminder of a cult mentality, or how some people are like, well, we're all in this together, really. So if I take my own life, you got to take your life with me. And that's kind of like, not what wokeness should be, or anything like that should be, where it's like, okay, if things don't go our way, we got to put other people in harm. Or it's even like, like when you see a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, where people were walking the roads and other things like that, encouraging other people to kind of join them and do the exact same thing. That's not a good thing, because you're encouraging other people to put their safety in a bad situation, really. So, that's what it's really talking about, And then what happens is that, Stan gets in trouble at school, and then he asks, like, PC principal, why are you super woke now? And what happened was, PC principal said, like, I realized that the woke culture was hopeless, and in times of hopelessness, you have to seek Christ, really. And I think what they're trying to say too is that there's movements like Occupy Wall Street, which fell apart, and then there's also movements like the Civil Rights Movement in the 70s that fell apart, really. So people just go back to praying to Jesus, because Jesus is like the ultimate savior. So sometimes people believe that story in the Bible. I think the story of Job, if I'm correct, like believing like things are hard, but you have to sit in there and take it and pray. And things do change slowly that way, but ultimately, the way things change quicker is by activism, So I think this episode is just talking about the consequences of what happens when you are not an activist and you choose to, decide to just, sit down and tolerate things. And what happens is that the town of South Park gets so fed up that they call Donald Trump, and they're kind of asking him things like, hey, why are you putting Jesus in school? Jesus does not belong in school. Donald Trump gets on the phone and he sues them for $5 billion. And it's kind of like what I've said too about freedom of speech, really, where you don't really have it, because if you did, you wouldn't be allowed to sue somebody over or speaking publicly about something, or protesting an opinion, really. But that happens all the time, because there's some people who say slander, defamation of character, and other things like that. And then also too, that sometimes the person you're suing can't afford a lawyer, really. So sometimes people are subjugated to going with what other people want to be said, really, and not want to be said. And then Cartman decides to kill himself in the car, and that's a reference to the High School Music episode, where Cartman doesn't like High School Musical, so he decides to kill himself in a electric car and he survives really. And then Butter's mom tells him, don't be antisocial, see what Cartman's doing. And that's a reference to the Trent Boyette episode where Cartman, Kyle, Stan, and Kenny, like, they pee on a teacher. And what happens in that episode is that as adults, when they're in fourth grade, we remember that scene where Butters is locked out of the house. His dad throws him outside, says, like, you need to play and whatever. And they don't see that Butters is in danger. And they also said something like, we just ignored his screams and whatever. So this is kind of the same thing where, like, Butters' mom ignores the fact that there's a kid in his car playing, and the kid in the garage playing with a hose. That kind of seems a little out of place, really. And just saying, oh, well, Butters is scared. I'm not paying attention to the fact that he's scared, really. So it's kind of like the issue with the Stotches that we see, where they don't really get that Cartman is somebody that puts their son's life in danger many, many times, and they also don't have a good relationship with Butters. So Butters continues that Stockholm Syndrome relationship with Cartman, where he keeps being put in danger based on Cartman's antics and hijinks. And the next thing is that they do a segment of 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes is on CBS, and then all the people on 60 Minutes are acting frightened, and they're also putting down South Park, because they're like, well, South Park is actually standing up to Trump and the $5 billion lawsuit. And then what CBS is saying that, this is what South Park is doing, but they're wrong for doing it because they don't want to get sued by Trump, really. So it kind of shows that it's sad, too, that the news outlets are more afraid of Donald Trump than South Park, when one is supposed to report reality and one's supposed to be a satire of reality. How South Park is fearless. But also, too, it goes down to what I've said before, which is you look at other countries like North Korea or even the time of Joseph Stalin, really, where people were always on their toes about, you have to make sure you say everything correctly so you don't offend the wrong person, really. And again, media is always about money, really. So what happens to a lot of people is that what happens to a lot of people when they have lots of money, really, is that, like, if you say the wrong thing, you get sued, or sometimes you get so much money, you spend all that money, and then you go into debt, really. So you're almost like betting on the next, contract and whatever, really. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people disagree with to do what they need to do and say what they need to say, really, because they're like, okay, I'm betting on the next big paycheck, really. So that's why a lot of news outlets and a lot of other people are like, okay, if somebody's offended, we have to agree with what they say. Or something like WWE does this all the time, really, when wrestlers speak inappropriately, they apologize, or when or like how they do a lot of advertisements, or they fine wrestlers whenever they say something out of line, really, because they're tied in with a lot of money, really, and their goal is to make the networks happy. And if they don't do that, they can be taken off the network, really. So one of the reasons why, South Park, they said something like they got, like, I think $1.5 billion through their deal, is one of the reasons why that happened was because if Matt and Trey spent that money, or they used that to pay off any Casa Bonita debts, they're going to be like, okay, we spent all this money, really, but now we got to agree with the network, because that way we make sure the show doesn't get canceled and there's a breach of contract where we have to pay that all back, really. So ultimately, it's almost like giving people a lot of money and then baiting them, which happens, really. So what happens is that somebody mentions the message of the episode, which is woke went too far, but it makes no sense to go too far the other way, really. And it goes with everything that I've been saying about, like, when you look at woke culture and characters like PC Principal, who are a satire of people getting fired and replaced, or how PC Principal would beat up Cartman, or how PC Principal is white, and a lot of the other PC people are white, so they don't get black issues and other issues because they've not really lived it, or women's issues because they've not, like, lived through that, through those, through those skin colors and those genders, really. And then you have this episode having Trump being like an example of pro-Trump or anti-woke, where he's actually going as far as encouraging Christianity. You disagree with what he has to say, he'll sue you into oblivion. and the news outlets and the media outlets will like allow that to happen really because the executives don't want to be paying extra money, whatever. So we see Jesus flying through the air to talk to the people of South Park. That's a reference to the Super Best Friend episode. And what happens is that Jesus is like speaking in a way that you can't understand, where he's like speaking with his lips closed like a ventriloquist, just to tell people to just, shut the fuck up, do what you're told, really, because he's also being sued as well. Like, Trump manages to sue Jesus. And then also, he mentions that CBS is owned by Paramount, and also Stephen Colbert got canceled. So it's something that recently happened. And I'm not sure why Stephen Colbert got canceled, but I think some people say, like, because he was anti-Trump, really. So there was a lawsuit, and that led to the Colbert Show getting canceled. So they're almost like saying that could happen to South Park. Another thing is that the Sermon on the Mount is something that happens in the Bible where Jesus preached to everybody. And it's kind of like what I was trying to say is that, networks are almost like the god of television shows. Networks are almost like a god because they can kind of continue a show. They can put money to birth a show. They can put a show into oblivion or cancellation. There's always that thing too where, let's say, you look at Roseanne, that show where it got canceled because Roseanne said some racist stuff. Dog the Bounty Hunter got canceled because Dog the Bounty Hunter said some racist stuff. So they can always there's always networks that can make up lies about maybe Matt and Trey, really, to be like, okay, well, maybe Matt and Trey said some racist things in their personal life. Or maybe, I'm not sure if Trey got divorced, but if he did get divorced, there's always people who can lie and say, oh, well, he was a woman beater, and then cancel their show because of that. So it's almost like, like when I see the scene, it's almost like saying that Paramount is God to South Park, or the news stations and the media stations are God, really, because they can cancel any show. They can defame and ruin the lives of people on the show just to help get something canceled, really. And then they can kind of continue the narratives that they want to continue, really. Just because they have all that power, really. So what happens is that Donald Trump does a settlement with South Park. And in the settlement, they have to pay $3.5 million to Donald Trump. So they're going to cut, a lot of different things in the show. I mean, different things such as, school funding and other things. So they're showing, how South Park, just like a lot of people who are getting sued, they get their lives ruined because that money comes from somewhere. And it's a reference to 2 episodes. I mean, it's a reference to 1 episode, the Sexual Harassment Panda episode, because obviously you see Gerald Broflovsky as the stereotypical Jewish lawyer. And then the other thing is that, as Sexual Harassment Panda said, that, when sexual harassment happens, you have to make sure that it's real, and not something blown out of context, because when that happens, there's people that will just sue, and then there's also people who just will just sue for the sake of suing, really. So it's a reference to those episodes. And then the last thing is that South Park also agrees to do a PSAs on Donald Trump, really, and the point of that is a couple of things, where they have drone footage and AI footage of Donald Trump, really. So it's a reference to the AI episode where I believe Wendy gets herself in trouble, and Stan just gets her out of trouble by using AI to write the ending of the episode, really. And that was also when Stan was using AI to talk to his girlfriend and help in school, really. So it's a reference to that. The whole thing about Trump walking around with his penis exposed, that's a reference, in my opinion, to Osama bin Laden has farty pants, because there's pictures of Osama bin Laden with a small penis in that episode. And then it's also a reference to the OnlyFans episode, Too Hot for Television, because there's a lot of exposure of Randy's penis in that episode. So that's where I'm kind of that's what I'm gonna say about it. And then also, people don't know this, but the voice actor of Towley started the show Wonder Chosen, and they kind of say, when you think about Wonder Chosen and its controversial humor, it influenced South Park because, like, the guy who worked on Wonder shows and is now working on South Park. So the whole thing about, like, his penis having, like, these two, like, little puppet eyes on it, that's reference to a lot of the puppets on Wonder shows, and also how Wonder shows it, and Xavier Renegade Angel, which was also done by the same people, PFFR, and other things like that. It's a reference to kind of like blending reality and animation because it's kind of jarring and juxtaposing. So, when they show the footage of Trump, they say something like, he's walked through the desert with us, and that's a reference to, like, Jesus walking through the desert, like how Trump may see himself as a god figure. And then the other thing about it is that they make him look very, very overweight because when Trump was a lot younger in his 40s, he used to have, like, a weight issue. And then the other thing too is that the thing about him walking through the desert, and I'll just repeat it, is that Jesus walked through the desert. So maybe Trump sees himself as a Christ figure when we're all human and none of this is a Christ figure. And then the other thing too is that and this is kind of weird because if you look at his shoe, when he takes off his shoe, it looks like a butt plug almost, like with the shape of it. So maybe they're trying to imply, maybe like there's some sexual deviancy, or he can shove that up his ass, really, maybe like as a joke, really. And then also that this is also kind of a joke as well, really, because they're saying, like, okay, we can do something where we have to do promo videos to promote Trump, really, but we can also just still make fun of him at the same time, really. And then the last part of it is that Cartman and Bart still try to kill themselves in the electric car with, like, getting, like, small doses of toxic fumes. And Cartman says, sweet death is about to come. I love you, man. And people say that's kind of a meta for Trey Parker, who does the voice of Cartman, saying that both to Matt Stone and Butterscotch, really, because Butterscotch, because Stan is supposed to be Trey, and Matt is supposed to be Kyle, and Eric Cartman is supposed to be that guy from All in the Family, Archie Bunker, and Kenny's supposed to be a kid that they knew in school, really. But Butterscotch is based on one of their friends who who was like an animation director or something like that, really. So it's almost like saying if they get canceled, at least they're not going to work with each other, so they just want to say I love you goodbye, really, because obviously when people don't work together, especially animation, they go off to other projects, really. So it's almost like like it's like, as I said, it's almost like being in a jar of water. It breaks and everybody goes their own direction, really. So I'm happy that I gave you guys this dissertation of that South Park episode. And I really think that the big message is, as I said, is a couple of things. That ultimately in America, you do not have free speech, really. And that means a few things. That ultimately you don't have free speech, but you have the illusion of free speech. You cannot say whatever you want because a lot of just like, social media and media outlets will censor what you have to say. Like, people were talking about, like, how a few years ago when people were forcing medication on other people because of illnesses that were going around, that Joe Biden talked to YouTube about saying that people disagreed with it, you would censor those videos, really. And it was proven that they did that. And you can't do that because if people agree or disagree about, the government endorsing medical advice or symptoms after receiving that medical advice and other things like that, the government has no right to say, okay, if you speak out against it or talk about why you're against it or how it negatively impacted you and freedom of choice, we're going to censor that. So, great example of how even with YouTube, that they pick and choose what is said and not said. And then also with Trump suing everybody, and media outlets is saying, okay, well, now we have to agree with what Trump has to say, really, because whatever he says is God, really. So again, that's the same thing in a foreign country where you have no rights, really. And then also too, like I've said many times, that it is a form of censorship because if you don't agree with what I say, I'm going to sue you into oblivion, and I can do that because I'm the president. I can afford lawyers, or he's a billionaire. He can afford lawyers, and other people can't really. Or, like I said, you really extend defamation of character and slander to really big levels, really. So it's definitely a very cerebral episode and really excellent satire.